In 1819, Spain ceded its Florida colonies to the United States, and future artist Martin Johnson Heade was born in Pennsylvania to a family of prosperous farmers. Heade first learned painting from his neighbor, the Quaker folk artist Edward Hicks. Heade spent his first few decades as a portraitist, traveling extensively and seeking out new clients and markets for his work. Although after 1841 Heade exhibited his work regularly at art shows, some say he spent his first 20 years of his career as a bad portraiture artist. Here is his painting of Sam Houston, which still hangs in the governor's mansion in Austin, Texas. In 1858, he moved to the 10th Street Studio building in New York City. There he met several artists from the Hudson River School, including one of its most prominent members, Frederick E. Church. Church and Heade became lifelong friends. At the 10th Street Studio, Heade would make coffee and Church would share some of his chocolate he got from a South American source. He moved out in 1861 to take up his mobile lifestyle again. In the 1860s and throughout the 1870s, Heade would sublet Church's studio and sometimes acted as an agent for Church. Church's work greatly influenced Heade, particularly Niagara. The Hudson River School, which flourished between 1825 and 1875, was an American landscape school whose work was characterized by detailed, realistic work in which nature, with a capital N, was revered and was viewed as a reflection of God and of God's blessing. During this time, America was in the second half of its first century and still struggling with the conceptualization of itself as a nation. Many of the Hudson River School artists moved on from the Hudson River Valley to other parts of the nation, particularly out west, to paint previously unrecorded scenes of America's majestic landscapes. These artists were explorers, recording and incorporating these landscapes into the nation's collective vision. And in the grandiosity of their works, you can sense the emotion behind Western expansion and manifest destiny. After Heade saw the painting Niagara and met Church, Heade became a landscape painter and gave up portraiture and began the second phase of his career. Church and Heade both created highly realistic, detailed depictions of landscapes that stressed an extreme 2-to-1 horizontal format, and both created wonderful depictions of light. Both had a love of natural sciences that affected their art in its subject and sensibilities. But whereas Church liked to record grand, sublime scenes like mountains and vistas, Heade was more interested in gentler, quieter landscapes. Notice the almost apocalyptic coloration of Church's sky. Heade, on the other hand, was a lifelong hunter and fisherman, and this experience provided him with advanced observational skills and an ability to understand and appreciate the natural environment. While Church and the other Hudson River School paintings used plants and birds to fill out a scene, they were often unidentifiable. Heade, on the other hand, even in his landscapes, would move foliage to the front of the scene and make it accurate, identifiable, and site-specific. He also conversed with his longtime friend astronomer Ibn Loomis about atmospheric conditions and its effects on light. This was really the first in a series of marshlands. Heade's most enduring and recurring subject. At least 120 marshland scenes have been identified. Also note, there's no dramatic focal point as with the Hudson River School. Nature is the subject. He took up landscape art as the heyday of the Hudson River School was sort of waning and people were becoming more interested in impressionistic art, like the Barbizon School in France. Heade was later, much later, grouped by art historians into the category Luminism. Luminism's features include a focus on the effects of light, hidden brushstrokes, the quiet and stillness of nature, and extraordinary attention to detail. Heade, along with Fitzhenry Lane, are the two painters most associated with Luminism. More than Church, Heade was the artist-scientist. He had read Audubon's works. He had read Audubon's contemporary, mentor, colleague, rival, Alexander Wilson. He read Darwin's 1857 Origin of Species. He read Darwin's 1862 work on the fertilization of orchids by insects. Like Audubon, Heade had a childhood obsession with birds, specifically hummingbirds, a fascination that would last a lifetime. In 1863 trip to Brazil, Heade created 20 paintings of hummingbirds. Heade, who was considered a naturalist during his time, spent a great amount of effort observing their behaviors. He also provides some elaborate backgrounds in an effort to suggest their environments or the ecosystems in which they lived. The Emperor of Brazil was impressed with his work and made him a knight, bestowing on him the country's highest honor, the Order of the Rose. Heade, like Audubon, went to England to find subscribers for his book that he wanted to create. He wanted to have chromolithographs made. Ultimately, this venture failed. Heade was concerned with the qualities of the lithographs, particularly the coloration, and because of other concerns, including financial ones, the book did not materialize. He was going to call it Gems of Brazil. Pictured here are 16 of the paintings displayed salon style at the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. He continued to make hummingbird and orchid paintings long into the future due to his own fascination, but also because they were good sellers. Church had traveled to South America before him to paint volcanoes and other more sublime-themed subjects. Church scolded Heade for not finding more dramatic views and sticking to the coast and accused him of timidity. In a letter, he promised not to tell artist Albert Birdstad, only his good friends. Heade continued to travel and move about widely throughout the United States, Europe, and South America. He purchased a home in St. Augustine in 1883, and he would reside in that city till his death in 1904. This most settled period of his career constitutes the third and final phase. His friend Church was surprised with the purchase of a home and even more surprised that he was married for the first time at 64 years of age to 40-year-old Elizabeth Smith of Long Island. The oil magnate and future railway baron Henry Morrison Flagler also relocated to St. Augustine, Florida in the 1880s. Flagler built a palatial hotel, the Ponce de Leon, for wealthy northern guests. The hotel, which opened on January 10, 1888, was built in the Spanish Renaissance style, replete with turrets, colonnaded walks, overhanging balconies, chandeliers, and stained glass windows by Louis Comfort Tiffany. The grounds featured elaborate gardens, particularly roses, and also an orange grove. Flagler built a second building with 7 studios that became known as Artist Row along the back side of the hotel. Flagler knew these artists and their works would help advertise the hotel. The artists held evening exhibitions and interacted with guests, creating the flavor of a Renaissance court. Other artists who lived in Artist Row, represented in the Rise and Fine Art collection, include Frank Shapley and Laura Woodward, who would soon follow Flagler in his railroad down to what would become Palm Beach. Martin Johnson Heade was the first artist to move into the studios, and as the most nationally known painter, he became the leading star of the St. Augustine art colony. Flagler became Heade's most important patron. In 1886, Flagler purchased a large landscape from Heade's home, the Great Florida Marsh. The hotelier then commissioned 2 more landscapes for $2,000 apiece, including the Great Florida Sunset. Heade, an avid fisherman, was one of the first artists to paint salt marshes. He painted them from Maine to Florida, where others saw flat, uninteresting terrain. Heade saw the rich biodiversity of the landscape. He was attuned to the ever-changing light on the waters. He recognized the value and beauty of wetlands before people had an ecological understanding of them. His main biographer, Thomas Stibbons, documented at least 120 paintings of eastern salt marshes, making this his largest subject. Heade, a lifelong sports hunter and amateur naturalist, spent hours upon hours carefully observing these habitats. In St. Augustine, he became an advocate for environmental protections. Beginning in 1881, Heade wrote a series of articles for Forest and Stream, today Field and Stream, the most important sports hunting magazine in the country at the time. Heade wrote articles advocating for social and legal protections of wetlands and wildlife under the pseudonym Didymus. At a time when tourists were still shooting alligators from the deck of steamboats, Heade pressed for fee-based hunting and fishing licenses, bag limits, and into commercial game hunting, particularly the plume trade. He called for an end to the selling of wild birds, feathers, heads, and bodies for the ornamentation of ladies' hats. The fashion industry was decimating Florida's avian populations. In 1886, George Bird Grinnell, editor of Forest and Stream, founded the Audubon Society to organize protections. Heade, as Didymus, wholeheartedly supported this effort, writing, "Nearly all women with souls worth saving have already joined the Audubon Society." Heade also advocated protection of non-game species such as manatees and sea turtles. At the beginning of the 20th century, he was concerned they would not last until the 21st century. In many of his forward landscapes, particularly the afterglow paintings of sunsets and sunrises, He'd experiment with tonalism, the school of American art influenced by the French Barbizon school, and that some say succeeded Luminism. In this school, one color tone dominates the image, yet even here, Heade is meticulous in his detail. As the viewer's eyes adjust to the hazy light, as in real life, he or she can begin to make out precise details and recognize specific plant and animal species. Heade was always the patient observer. After salt marsh landscapes, Heade's second favorite subject was flowers. In Florida, he created paintings of roses, Cherokee roses, jasmine, orange blossoms, and magnolias. Today, his magnolia paintings are particularly admired by art critics. In 2004, the United States Postal Office issued a stamp featuring Heade's oil painting giant magnolias on a blue velvet cloth. His flower paintings were rich, finely detailed, hyper-realistic, and luminous. His Florida flower paintings made perfect souvenirs for wealthy tourists who took home a lasting image of a fleeting flower and memories of a Florida vacation. St. Augustine was the most stable period of his life, where he enjoyed for the first time the support of a spouse and a steady patron. Heade responded by creating beautiful, meticulously accurate paintings of Florida's special quality of life, her waterways, and her flowers. He also advocated for environmental protections for a land he had come to love. He remained quite healthy until late in life. Heade was often seen in his 70s and 80s riding his bicycle around town until his death in 1904. Heade was largely forgotten after his death until a 1943 exhibition of 19th century Romantic painters at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. This show featured his Thunderstorm at Narragansett Bay, which was a sensation. The painting had been purchased at a New York antique shop. The program read that he was active between 1847 and 1884. So he basically had disappeared from the radar after moving to Florida. Today, Heade's paintings remain a testament to Florida's natural beauty and biodiversity. Heade is now considered an American master, and his star continues to rise. But the press in St. Augustine, particularly the local Tatler, always loved Heade and regularly bragged upon him in the papers.